Color, contrast, and cleanup. Those are the three pillars of my post-processing strategy. Let's talk about it on this episode of Micromatic. So if you've been doing photography for any amount of time, you've probably figured out by now that post-processing is really half the work. Or if you're just getting into photography, that's something you're going to have to learn, is that post-processing is important. All those great photos you've seen across the internet, they didn't just come out of the camera looking like that. You gotta take the right picture with the camera, but once you bring it home and you get it onto your computer or your phone or however you're doing your post-processing, you do have to do some work in that post-processing to really bring out everything that you can in that photo and make it the image that you want it to be. Now, even if you are already doing your own post-processing and you kind of have your own workflow, your own strategy, what you're doing, you still might feel like you're just kind of going in there and moving sliders around until things look the way, they look better, but you don't necessarily have a strategy. You don't know exactly what you're after. You're just kind of each image pulling it in and tweaking it until it looks, what you think is good. But I do think it is important for both consistency and just your time that you go into your post-processing with a strategy. Like you have something in mind that you're going to be doing with this photo, and you don't waste time moving sliders around until it looks kind of right. You know what you're trying to do, and you do those things, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this episode of Micromatic. As I said when I opened this video, there are three basic pillars to my post-processing strategy. I'm going to talk about each of them and give you some examples of how I use them. We've got color, contrast, and cleanup. They all start with C's. That's pretty convenient. It makes it easy to remember, as if I might have planned this. But yeah, let's just go through them each one by one, and I'll give you some examples of how I apply those to some real photographs that I've taken. All right, so now with color, the first pillar of my strategy, the basic goal, at least for me, is to get the color in the photograph to be accurate. That's what I'm interested in, is in accurate colors. I'm not looking for a super saturated look. I'm not looking for an Instagram VSCO look, but maybe you are, and that's okay, all right? Color is still this basic strategy, or this basic pillar of that strategy, having color as one of those things that you focus on. Just know what you're trying to do with the color before you go into the photograph. Now, when I'm trying to make the color accurate, there are three basic things that I need to do. So step one, open up Photoshop, open up Lightroom, whatever your photo processing tool of choice is, and close it. Because the first two steps you need to do before you actually get into your photo processing. Now, the first step to getting accurate color in your photographs is to make sure that you're working with an accurate display. If you take one photo, unadjusted photo, and you view this photo on a laptop versus a desktop display versus a mobile display, you might find that the color actually looks slightly different between each display. And that's just because each display tends to have its own color balance and its own biases. And if you really want to get accurate color in your photograph, you need to make sure that you profile out those biases from your display's color. Now, there are a couple of different tools that you can use to profile your display. The two that I've used a Color Monkey display and I've used a Spider 5 Pro. Between those two, I preferred the Color Monkey a little bit. I thought the software was a little bit easier, just a little bit simpler of a process. The Spider did basically the exact same thing, although I actually kind of preferred the color that I got with the Color Monkey as well. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to use that tool. It's going to output a profile for your computer to adjust the colors on your monitor so that they match real life colors. And that's important because you want your photograph, if you choose a particular hue of red in your photograph, you want that to actually be the color that's baked into the photograph, not just the color that it looks on your monitor. So now you've got an accurate color display. You have to make sure that you've got accurate colors coming from your camera. And so the second step is to profile the color of your camera, because if you take a picture of the same scene with multiple different cameras, they've got all exactly the same settings from white balance to shutter speed, and you take that same image from all those different cameras, put it on the same display, you're going to find that the color, again, is different between each of them because each camera has its own color profiles, its own biases. And some cameras will have baked in oversaturation, some will have biases toward, like Panasonic cameras tend to be pretty blue. And if you want your photos to be accurate and natural, you have to create a profile, a camera profile that your raw editing software can use that will remove those biases from the image. Now, one of the tools for profiling your camera is something like this. This is a color checker passport, and there's other color checkers like this. They're all basically the same thing, which is a grid of very, very specific colors that you can use your camera, take a picture of this grid exactly, bring it up on your accurate display, and then you can then adjust the colors. You basically look at your monitor, look at the thing that you have set next to you, and you adjust the colors of the picture until the photograph that you've taken very accurately matches the real life object in your hand. Now, one thing that's nice about the Color Checker Passport is it comes with software where you can take this picture, load it up in the software, and the software knows exactly what these color values should be, and it'll output a profile for you. Once you have that profile, you can then kind of make it a default for your raw editing software of choice, whether that's Lightroom or Photoshop or something else. And then the last step for accurate color in your photographs is to make sure you get the white balance right. And this is where I think it's key that you shoot in a RAW format rather than in JPEGs, because when you are shooting pictures out in the field, your camera is probably going to be detecting a white balance for you automatically. You might be setting it manually, but either way, there's a good chance that the white balance that your camera had as a setting when you took that picture isn't the best, the optimal white balance setting. And you're gonna wanna adjust that. Now, if you shot that photo in a RAW format, it doesn't matter that you got it wrong in the camera, because the white balance is sort of it's an adjustment value based on everything that's stored in that RAW file. And you can adjust that value in your RAW editing software, and it will be exactly as if you had gotten it right in the camera at the moment that you shot the photo. If you're shooting in a JPEG format, you can still use your photo editing software's white balance adjustment tool. It's just not going to be quite as effective at correcting the white balance in the scene. Let's head over to the laptop and I'll show you exactly how I use the white balance tool on a couple of photographs that I've taken. Here I've got a handful of photos that each have their own challenges with color. In this photo, we've got a picture of a monkey, and you can see that the entire photo kind of has a bit of a green cast on it. In this photo, we've got a nighttime scene, and the color of the lighting was very yellow, very orange. It's like a street lamp style. And it has completely ruined the color of the photograph, but thankfully we've shot this in a RAW format, so that won't be a problem, and I'll show you exactly how. And then a very similar situation with this last photo. The street lamps have made the entire picture orange and kind of a neon blue. This is not exactly what it looked like to my eye, and with a little bit of color correction, we can make this look more accurate. All right, so we've got the picture of the monkey here open in Adobe Camera Raw. And I'm going to show you how simple it is to correct the color. So maybe it doesn't already stand out to you that this entire image has a bit of a green cast to it. You know, obviously the leaves are green, you expect that much, and the monkey's face is red. But you may or may not notice that there is a green cast all over this monkey. So what you can do is you can select the eyedropper tool here in Camera Raw, which is the white balance tool, and you just select an area that is a neutral color. And neutral, just anything that's white or gray or black, something that doesn't have color in it. So white balance adjustment is all about adjusting these things, right? You're adjusting the color temperature and you're adjusting the tint. Temperature is going between blue and yellow. Tint is going between green and magenta. And so what you want to do is you want to select the eyedropper white balance tool, and you want to click on, with that tool selected, you want to click on something in the photo that is neutral. And by neutral I mean it's something that's neither blue nor yellow, neither green nor magenta. Basically you're looking for grays, whites, and blacks. So in this photograph, you know, we've got a bunch of color that could potentially be neutral. I'm going to go ahead and go with this tree branch, which is probably not exactly neutral, but it'll probably get me pretty close. And you'll see, as soon as I make a selection with this tool, the overall white balance of the photo is going to be set, and it's probably going to be a lot more accurate than it was before. So here you can see just kind of a before and after. This feels so much more accurate to me than this. This again was had a heavy green cast to it. This looks much better to me. And now, you know, it still might feel a little bit cool to my liking, and so I can come in here and just do a little bit of manual adjustment to the white balance, but really this tool, the eyedropper tool, will get you really close to where you want your white balance, and then you can just dial in, you know, a little bit of extra coolness or warmth depending on the scene. You know, what was the lighting condition like as you photographed it, and how do you want it to come across? So here, this to me looks much better than that. Now let's head over to the second scene, which is the nighttime scene, which was, you know, it was pretty well ruined by the color cast of the street lamp here, right? This here is supposed to be a white umbrella. This here is a yellow umbrella. Kind of everything at this point looks pretty yellow. Even down here in the shadows, this all looks really yellow. But if I select my eyedropper tool and I find a neutral color, which, you know, this should be roughly neutral. It's going to be a little bit difficult because of the yellow light cast on it, but, you know, let's find an area that's maybe in shadow. Generally, when you're looking for neutral colors, a neutral within shadow is going to give you a more accurate white balance than a neutral that is under direct colored light. And you can see that quickly the image looks so much more accurate. This yellow down here maybe looks a little undersaturated, and that's something I can correct outside of the white balance. But really this right here finally looks white. Before it looked totally yellowish red, kind of neon colored. There it actually looks like a white umbrella. Up here you can see the rain coming down. It looks like rain. It doesn't look like neon sludge. And that's as simple, you know, that's how simple correcting your color can be. And then finally we'll take this other night scene, which poses actually a much more difficult problem. And the difficult problem here is that we've got multiple light sources with different colors, okay? Down here, the light source is all of these street lamps, and they all are very, very yellow, as you can see. The background is the sky, which is, you know, basically not lit, but there is moonlight there, and moonlight color is the color of daylight. It's just a white light. And because this is all yellow, this is now, here, I'll show you exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to use this eyedropper tool, and I'm going to find a neutral object. Would be something like the metal on this pole, right? The metal on this pole should be pretty gray, so I'll select that, and I'll adjust the photo. And now down here, this is all starting to feel a little bit more accurate. This still feels like it's got a bit of a blue cast to it. But up here, now we've got, maybe a little bit too much extra magenta. No, it's too much extra green. And so, you know, maybe this is a problem. Maybe this is a difficult photo, and it is. But what you can do is you can take this eyedropper tool, you can drag it around to different parts and find the place that gives you maybe the best balance overall, right? Different sections that you select are going to give you slightly different white balance. And then what you can also do is you can use a gradient tool and apply a white balance with that gradient tool. So I can, if the sky now looks like it has too much green, I can use this gradient tool to put some of that magenta back into it, maybe put some of that yellow back into it so that it doesn't feel quite so neon blue. And I've done that without affecting the white balance of the scene up here in the front. And then I can also do, you know, the opposite. I can have a gradient go down there at the bottom, and we can maybe make it a little bit extra blue. Definitely need to move it away from green. And now this is starting to feel pretty accurate. Let's say the overall scene is maybe a little blue. Okay, this is starting to feel pretty good, right? So this is where we started. Now you can see the stark contrast, right? This is a big difference. This is where we started, where everything is just yellow in the foreground, very dark blue up at the top. We switch it over to with these adjustments, and this is starting to feel like much more accurate color. Now, the second pillar of my post-processing strategy is contrast corrections. And contrast really ends up being the bulk of the work that I do in a photo in my post-processing work is adjusting the contrast. And now contrast really breaks down to two overarching ideas, right? You want to correct the global contrast of your photo. And that is, you know, the contrast that applies to the entirety of the photo. You want the overall impression of the image to be accurate and realistic, and so you want the contrast to come across realistically. And now the tools that I use for global contrast are things like curve adjustments or even the unsharp mask, which I'll show you in the examples down below. But then there's also local adjustments, and local adjustments are made for really guiding the viewer's eye, and that's what contrast is really all about, right? The global aspect of contrast, you just want to make the scene look accurate and realistic, not distracting. With local contrast adjustments, you are effectively guiding the viewer to look at the part of the scene that you want. Here's kind of an important philosophy that frankly, you could apply to things outside of photography, but it's very important here in photography. And the idea is that contrast attracts attention, okay? When whatever part of your photograph is the most contrasty, that's where the viewer's eye is going to naturally fall. And just kind of as an example of how contrast attracts attention, imagine you're in a comedy club and someone tells a funny joke, the entire crowd laughs. A person 3 rows ahead of you is laughing. You don't notice them because their laughter matches everybody else, right? But imagine you have that same person 3 rows ahead of you in a library and they start busting out laughing. You'll probably notice them. And that's because there's contrast between the silence and the loud laughter. The same exact principle applies to photography and light. Now, when you're adjusting contrast, it really is all about changing shadows and highlights and either reducing the difference between the highlights and the shadows or increasing the difference to create more contrast. Now, the 2 main tools that I use for local contrast adjustments are gradients and brushes. A gradient tool will allow you to, maybe gradually and very naturally reduce the contrast of a background element or maybe even a foreground element, and then bring the contrast back up toward the section of the photograph where you want the contrast. Whereas brushes let you make much more fine detail changes. They allow you to get in and really pull out the highlights that you want and push back the shadows to create that sharp contrast where you want the viewer's eye to go. And some examples of where you might use local contrast. Let's say you're shooting a portrait of someone and you really want the contrast to be on the person's face. If there's a busy background behind the person, you don't want that stuff to be distracting. And so you can reduce the contrast of the background elements while increasing the contrast of the foreground or the face, the subject. And you can just very naturally bring the viewer's attention to the parts of the photograph that you want them to be looking at. Let's head back to the laptop for a couple of examples of how I use contrast for my photographs. Now, I've got a few examples here that are going to show you how I do contrast adjustments in Photoshop. They've each got kind of different goals with them in the way that I'll use contrast, but the overarching strategy is still the same, right? So here's a photograph I took. I really like the composition of this photo, and this is kind of the subject area that I want is in this lower right corner with the person standing in the shadow. But the contrast, of this whole pillar kind of means that the eye doesn't naturally fall right here. And so what I can do is I can use color, or I can use contrast adjustments to make it so that the viewer's eye just naturally falls where I want it. And now these other 2 photos that I've got actually have maybe a little bit more flexibility in them. I wanted to use these photos so that I can show you how you can use contrast to guide the eye. Okay, so in this photograph, I've got a picture of a dirt path winding along a mountain and some really cool clouds up in the background. And what I can do with contrast is I can make it so that either the foreground with this path becomes the subject, and that's where your eye naturally goes, or I can use contrast and I can make it so that the clouds become the subject and where your eyes will naturally follow. And a similar thing I can do with this photo of a night scene where, I can either use contrast to guide the user's eyes back to this, bunch of cars that are kind of in focus down here, or I can use contrast to bring your attention up to this car that's whizzing by, this kind of maybe more exciting motion photograph. So let's start with this scene, and I'm going to open up a copy of this same image. So we have 2 different versions of the same image, which right now look exactly the same, and I'm going to post-process each version in a different way to accentuate. In one photograph, accentuate the clouds, and in one photograph, accentuate the path. And you can see how just by using contrast, you can really change the way that the viewer sees your image. So let's start with this guy. And a useful tool to start with is the gradient tool. And in Photoshop, you have to access that through the Adobe Camera Raw. So go into your gradient tool, and we're going to start here. Let's just make the sky stand out more. So I'll start with this gradient tool. I'll drag a gradient across the sky. And the things that I want to adjust are the contrast. And now I could go in here and just dial in this contrast tab. But there's actually some other tools for doing that too. And what I like personally is the dehaze filter. So I take this dehaze filter, and you can see just already, immediately, I'm creating more contrast in that sky. Maybe even bring down the exposure so that the darkness in that sky starts to stand out more than the whites. And this is also going to give me a little extra latitude with my brushes once I get into Photoshop to dial in that contrast, right? So here's just the difference that I've done in Camera Raw using just the gradient. And you can see already that I think the viewer's eye is a little naturally pulled to those clouds. You can then create another gradient if you wanted to down here, and we'll do essentially the opposite, right? We can take that dehaze filter and pump it up this way. Be careful with it with negative dehaze filter because it can start to make the image look a little unnatural. And there you can see the before and after. That's using just the gradient tool. But then what I'll also do is I'll go in here and I'll use my brushes, my dodge and burn brushes. And with the dodge tool, generally you want to be dodging highlights. And with the burn tool, you generally want to be burning the shadows. And what that does is that's increasing the contrast, right? So if I have this on burn, I'm going to come up here into the sky, and it's going to make all the dark parts of the sky even darker. And I'm being kind of sloppy with this right now, but that's essentially the way that I use it. And you can see the difference between those. It just feels like it's a little punchier, and maybe it feels like I've reduced the exposure, right? So I've actually, by using contrast, I've reduced the exposure of the top of this scene, but I've actually made it stand out more. Even though this scene is still lighter compared to that, it's making this part stand out more. And you can do the same thing with your highlights though. If you want to bring some of that exposure back, just pull out the highlights. And you can see the difference there. And then you can do the opposite. You can reduce contrast using these dodge and burn tools. Dodging, you can dodge midtones and shadows. I actually recommend against dodging with shadows. Midtones is pretty good if you want to like kind of reduce the chunkiness of an area that feels like it's maybe got a little bit too much weight in it. You can dodge the midtones to reduce that contrast. I don't really recommend dodging shadows because it's going to start making the photo look unrealistic, but you can burn with the highlights. And that will basically just do it very lightly. You don't want to, you're not trying to make this feel unnatural. You still want the photo to look natural. You're just trying to reduce the natural contrast so that the viewer's eye goes to where you want it. And that difference is, very subtle. You may not even be able to tell here on YouTube, but here is sort of the before and after with that contrast adjustment, trying to bring the viewer's eye to the sky. Now let's do the exact opposite. Here's my copy of that photo that started from the exact same position as that last photo, and let's make it so that the path stands out here. So do a similar thing. We'll go into Adobe Camera Raw and we will use gradient tool to increase contrast a little bit. And we're going to reduce contrast a little bit in the sky. And just to show you what the before and after, what that looks like, right? This is mostly just kind of setting ourselves up for the actual post-processing, the brush work, that stuff that we're going to be doing here in Photoshop. And so now here is where we can take our brushes. We can burn some shadows. Right, and this is, you got to be careful with this not to overdo it, but you want to just kind of apply a little bit of extra contrast, which again, it's making this lower area of the photograph darker, which you might think intuitively that that's going to make it stand out less, but no, it's actually contrast that attracts your eye. It's not brightness. So you make it a little bit darker, but then you come in here and you dodge the highlights so that you increase the brightness, and that's naturally going to give the viewer the impression that this is the most interesting section of the photograph. This is where they should be looking, right? So now here's the difference, before and after. Now I've actually made a mistake here, and it's good that I made a mistake here because this is where I wanted to show you something, and that's the difference between RGB color and lab color. They're basically just different color spaces and different ways to adjust color in your post-processing software. Photoshop has it. I know other software that I've used has it. I don't know that Lightroom lets you use lab mode, but the main difference is that when I'm adjusting contrast and I'm in RGB color, and you can see this photo here is in RGB color, when I'm adjusting contrast, the colors will tend to shift a little bit. And I've done all that work at the very beginning of my process to try and get accurate colors. I don't want the colors to be shifting on me while I'm adjusting the contrast. So if I go between this photo and this photo, you can see that this color down here, which was, kind of like a neutral sandy color, has become a little bit of a neon orange color, and that's not accurate. That's not what it looked like. That's not what I want from the photo. I want the extra contrast that I got down here, but I don't want it to look like that. So I have to undo everything I've just done and redo it while in lab mode. You can go up here, edit image, or you go image mode, lab color. And now what I'm going to do essentially the same exact brush workflow things to darken this foreground area, and then pull out the highlights. And you're going to see that I've done the same thing, right? I've increased the contrast down here, but I haven't given it that orange tint that I accidentally gave to it when I had the photo still in RGB mode. That's why I like lab mode, and that's actually one of the main reasons why I use Photoshop. But you can see here, these photos are an example of how just using contrast completely changes the photograph and what the viewer's eye naturally gravitates towards. And when you're processing any of your photographs, think about, where do I want the viewer's eye to go, and use contrast to do that. Now, the two primary tools that I use for global contrast adjustments are curves and the unsharp mask. So I'll start with curves. And again, it's important to have your photo in lab color mode for this, because if you do these curve adjustments without lab color, you have a good chance that you're going to shift the colors in a way that you don't want to. Really, I'm just trying to change the contrast, change the lightness levels, not the color levels. So you can create a new curve. And I typically do this with two curves. I'll start with one curve that sets my black levels essentially, right? I just kind of move this around with an anchor point down near the bottom of the curve to add contrast into the shadows. And I try to get it to a point where it feels like the shadows are natural. It gets to black where I want it to be black, but it's not black where I don't want it to be. And now, the entire image at this point is too dark. And so what I'll do is I'll create a second curve adjustment, and I'll do the opposite, as I will adjust the highlights of the photo. So I select the curve, the top right area of the curve, and I just adjust this until I get the highlights to be as bright as I want to be, but without clipping, right? I don't want areas to be full bright white, because that just means that's a loss of detail. That doesn't look natural at all. And this will show you just the before and after difference just using the global contrast, right? This is before, this is how I started with the photo, and just using those curves to apply a little global contrast to the entire photo, you can see that it's just made it feel a lot more natural and a lot more accurate to what I saw with my eyes. Now, that second tool that I use for global contrast is the unsharp mask, and that is available under Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. Now don't let the name fool you. You can use the unsharp mask to add sharpness to your photo, but typically I use Smart Sharpen for adding sharpness. I use the unsharp mask for applying essentially a global contrast increase. And you can see with this, you can kind of dial this in however you want, and the effect that you get with the unsharp mask is, frankly, it's pretty subtle. You may not even be able to pick it up here on YouTube, but I promise you it's making a difference here. But you can see the difference. If I toggle preview on and off, it's just subtly increasing the contrast of everything in the scene. And it's doing it uniformly. This is a global contrast adjustment. But it is good for just kind of giving a little extra bite to the photos, just a little bit extra dimension to it. And then one last view of this photo before and after. This is how it started, and this is what it looks like with all of those global contrast adjustments. There are no local contrast adjustments done in this photo. It's all been global, and you can see how we've made that scene feel just a lot more alive and a lot more striking just with contrast. And then the third final pillar of my post-processing strategy is cleanup. And I'll be honest, this one's kind of a cop-out in that there's a bunch of different things that I've kind of bunched up into this cleanup pillar. Cleanup is really all about kind of removing distractions and just adding that extra bit of polish and shine on a photograph to finish it off. So the main things that I'm looking at when I'm doing the cleanup processing of my photo, and part of this happens at the very beginning of my process, and part of it happens at the very end of my process. Some of the cleanup things that I do at the very beginning of my post-processing are things like chromatic aberration fixes, right? If you've got any chromatic aberrations, just find the tool in your photo editing software, click the button or whatever, and remove the chromatic aberrations. Really simple. But other things like, correcting the perspective or correcting the horizon, right? If your photo is just slightly out of tilt and the horizon's tilting a little bit, it's going to be really distracting. And so just spend a second rotating it to make sure that that's not a problem. Perspective correction is maybe a little bit more involved, but it's along the same lines. This is like the cleanup process. It's the perspective is maybe a little bit off. Spend a little bit of time using your perspective tools to correct the perspective so that any distracting lines, any converging lines, the things that you don't want in your photograph, you can remove. And the more toward the middle of the post-processing, I'll worry about correcting blemishes or removing blemishes from the photograph. And that might be, an actual blemish on the face of a subject, or it might be, like a cigarette butt or something on the ground, or a piece of trash in the background, or maybe it's a bit of dust or small hair that you didn't want in the photograph, but it's there. Just spend a little bit of time, use things like the healing tool in Photoshop to just get rid of it. And then the last bit of cleanup that I worry about is noise reduction and sharpness. And to be honest, I actually don't spend much time with noise reduction. I probably should think about that a little bit more, but I generally shoot my cameras at base ISO, so I don't worry about noise too much. Sharpness, however, that's pretty important. And so sharpness is a thing that I do at the very end of my post-processing workflow. The last thing I do is I sharpen the photo, sort of a finishing touch, and then I save it with that little extra bit of sharpness, just to add a little extra clarity to the photo and make it, a better file for printing or sharing online. And here finally, just a few examples of some of those cleanup steps that I talked about. This photograph is a photograph that has a problem with chromatic aberration. And once I've got it open up in Adobe Photoshop, I will show you exactly what I mean. If I zoom in on the photo here, you can see down here in the wheel area, there's a lot of pink going on. And this motorcycle is not pink. The color on this photo is more or less accurate right here, except for this pink which is showing up. And that's just because of the lens I was shooting. It suffers from chromatic aberrations when it's shot wide open like this. It was probably dumb for me to shoot it wide open, but that's what happens. And so you just want to use, the chromatic aberration tool, correction tool in your photo editing software to fix that. Here in Adobe Camera Raw, it's under lens corrections, and it's called defringing, color fringing, chromatic aberration, kind of the same thing. With this software, you just pick an amount and then it goes away. And basically, you should just be picking an amount that's the smallest amount that you can get away with while completely fixing your problem, if that makes sense, right? The more you do this, if I just drag this all the way over here, there's more of a chance of it creating a problem with color that's not actually a chromatic aberration. So what you want to do is just dial it in as much as you need it and not any more than that. So you can see here the before and after. Now, this is so subtle you may or may not even see it on YouTube, but there's definitely pink that was in this photograph that has now been pulled out. Now this photo I pulled up because this is a good example of a photo that needs its horizon corrected. If I just posted this photo as is, it's going to feel really unnatural because everything's kind of leaning over to the left. This photo is tilted. I was not standing straight. I was not holding the camera straight as I probably should have been. And so there's different tools for correcting the perspective or the orientation of the photograph. In Camera Raw, you've got the transform tool, which will do what you need. One thing that I would say is an important pro tip is to enable the grid. And this basically just creates a bunch of lines on your image that will help you to line up things in your photograph that should be lined up with them. So when I'm correcting the perspective, you've got vertical lines and you've got horizontal lines. And I can rotate the image so that those lines line up with my grid. And now sometimes, depending on how you've taken the photograph, you'll have to choose between aligning the vertical lines or aligning the horizontal lines. And generally, I'll say this, you should align your grids with the object that is the furthest away, because that's going to be the most likely to give you a balanced image. When there are objects that are closer to you, like let's say this section of the rail, and there are objects that are closer to you, they're more likely to be warped by perspective, such that you're not going to get the right perspective just by rotating the image, whereas objects in the distance are much more likely to not be affected by perspective distortion, and so you can very safely adjust your rotation to match those things. So here I'm going to find this as a horizontal line, some of these distant lines here that I'm going to try and match to, right? That looks pretty good. So the before and after with just a very simple rotation, that's much better. Now I'm going to have to crop out this little empty white space, but that's much less of a problem than having a photograph that completely feels wrong because it is off center. Now here is a lovely photograph of a San Francisco street ground, which is pretty disgusting. The only reason I'm showing you this photo is because it's got some things in it that you might obviously want to take out of your photograph, and that's part of the cleanup process. So these cleanup steps will happen within Photoshop, not within Camera Raw. And you've got access to a handful of tools, including the patch tool, the spot healing brush tool, and the healing brush tool. The two that I mainly use are spot healing tool and the patch tool. So let's start with the spot healing tool, which is really effective for very small blemishes, especially in areas that are patterned, right? So let's say I don't want this trash showing up down here in the lower right. I can zoom in on it, I can take my brush and click on it, and it's magically gone. This will probably work with that as well. It'll probably work with that as well. Bam, bam, bam. This tool is really good when it works well because it's super easy, super easy. You just click on the thing you want, and depending on the situation, it'll heal the thing into oblivion, which is great. Where this tool doesn't work so well is in more complicated areas like the cigarette. So if I make this tool big enough to cover up the cigarette and click on it, you're going to see it doesn't quite look right. These lines, maybe no one's going to notice it. I'm going to notice it. And so this is where I would use the patch tool. The patch tool is a little bit more analog of a process, or a little bit more manual of a process. So what you do is you can draw around the area that you want to change, and then you can move this around until you can kind of get a little preview of what your photo will look like once you release, and then release, and you've got a healed area. Now that cigarette's gone, all this mess down here is better, and isn't it just a beautiful, no, it's still disgusting, San Francisco street, but you can see the difference that a little bit of cleanup can do. And now this photo is a photo that is essentially done with its post-processing, and it just has one last step, which is to apply a little bit of sharpening. And now sharpening, what it's going to do is it's just going to make it so that the details here in these very fine branches are as sharp and as detailed as possible. And the tool that I typically use for sharpening is in Photoshop. I go to Filter, Sharpen, and I use Smart Sharpen. And now hopefully on YouTube you can tell the difference that this is making, but there is a very big difference. If I turn preview off, it's a soft image. If I turn preview on, it's showing you the sharpening that I'm going to get, which is just making the detail in this photo much, much stronger. And now you can adjust your sharpening amount. You want to get to a point where you are effectively increasing the amount of detail that you're seeing, but you're not over sharpening it to the point where you are just making disgusting halos around your edges, which is very, very possible. And this is here just showing you before and after with that sharpening applied and unapplied. And I hope you can agree that that makes this photo, even in this zoomed out state, it improves the photo. It improves the perception of detail, and that's what I want to convey with this photo. So sharpening, yeah, again, that's my last step right before I save the photo, and it's a nice little finishing touch. So that's it. Those are the 3 basic pillars of my post-processing strategy. And whether you want your photos to look like mine or you have your own style in mind, that's okay. I think these 3 pillars still apply. When you're editing a photo, it all really comes down to color, contrast, and cleanup. Those are the things that you should be going into when you pull up your picture and you're like, all right, this is what my photo looks like now. I know what I want it to look like. How can I adjust the color to make it look like that? How can I adjust the contrast to make it look the way I want? And how can I clean it up to just kind of give it those finishing touches? These basic ideas kind of work no matter what post-processing software you're using. Personally, I use Adobe Photoshop with Camera Raw, as you saw in the laptop scenes. Maybe in a video I'll talk about why I prefer that software versus everything else I've tried. But yeah, that's what I use. I use Adobe Camera Raw with Photoshop. But yeah, these same ideas will apply if you're using Lightroom or Snapseed or kind of anything else that I've tried. You just have different tools at your disposal to accomplish essentially those same goals. If you liked this video, you thought it was helpful, you learned something, go ahead and give it a thumbs up down below. Maybe even share it with a friend if you know someone who could use this information. If you've got your own ideas for how you like to post-process your photos, you've got your own strategy in mind, maybe leave some comments down below. We can talk about it. I'm interested. If you like this video and you'd like to see more like it, you can subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next episode of Micromatic.